This chapter will focus on East Asian societies from the 3rd to 12th century. Following the collapse of the Han Dynasty, the Chinese Empire was divided by 3 kingdoms. Remember what happens when you start to divide an empire, such as happened with Rome and Charlemagne. The empire will fracture. Collectively, they could not withstand internal and external challenges. There would also be a series of epidemics which diminished the population from an estimated 60 million to 16. The Han Dynasty had been supported by filial piety and devotion to social order. Following the Han's collapse, Confucianism declined. Due to trade along the Silk Route and nomadic invasions, China over time embraced Buddhism. However, it was of a different branch, Mahayana Buddhism, which embraced a social structure of monasteries, priests, etc. Buddhism's call for curbing desire was in line with the modesty of Confucius. Also, the Chinese could not grasp the chaos in their societies, but they could strive for inner peace. If they followed that righteous path, they could reach nirvana. Remember, Confucianism was not a religion, but a philosophy or a way of life. Buddhism offered the Chinese hope. Here you can see the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road into China and also into Korea and Japan, and later further south into parts of the area of Cambodia. This is a Buddhist temple in northwest China that still remains today. China reunited under the Sui dynasty from 589 to 618. Yang Jian was a northern general whose daughter married the emperor. When the emperor died, the son was too young, so Yang, the grandfather, led as regent until eventually claiming a new dynasty for himself. He conquered southern states and eventually reunified China and instituted similar cultural symbols of the former Han dynasty. His main achievement was to begin working on a grand canal linking the Yellow River to the Yangtze for a north-south inland waterway. Unfortunately, his son and grandson did not rule effectively, and another general, the Duke of Tang, assumed power. This is a picture of the Grand Canal, which again still exists today. The Tang dynasty ruled from 618 to 907. The Duke's son, Li Shimin, became an effective general. He murdered his brothers and forced his father to abdicate. He is most known for conquering Turkestan in the west and ushering an era of prosperity. Legend has it that one of Li's concubines was Wu Zhao, who would become Empress Wu. Following Li Shimin's death, she was forced to be a nun at a Buddhist convent at the age of 24. She then met with the new emperor and married him. As he became ill, she ran the empire for him, and when he died, locked up her sons so she could officially rule. Therefore, she ruled unofficially from 660 to 705 until a palace coup ended her reign. Most historians view her rule favorably for achievements, although it was brutal. By the mid-800s, rivalry erupted between Confucian administrators and Buddhists, causing internal revolts. By 907, the dynasty collapsed, thus allowing for rule by warlords. This is a map of the Tang dynasty, and as I mentioned, Li Shimin had conquered the Turks in Central Asia. The Song dynasty would rule from 960 to 1127. General Zhao Qunyin fought off the warlords and reunified China. He created impressive reforms to strengthen China. First, he did not go on foreign adventures, thus saving treasure. Second, as seen throughout history, generals often would gain a lot of power amongst their troops and become regional warlords. Zhao was smart and rotated the generals to different provinces, thus lessening their power. This is a map of the Song Empire. Zhao also standardized the civil service exams. The Chinese had abandoned the civil service exams. Power would be passed down on favorites. So General Zhao standardized the civil service exam, where individuals would have to take fair tests marking their competence in Confucian scholarism and finance. Wang Anshi became the main advisor to the emperor from 1069 to 1085. During that 16-year period, he attempted to reform the tax the rich and offer low-interest loans to the poor, plus developing internal infrastructure. Trade and commerce erupted, and the merchant class started to rise in stature versus the wealthy landowning class. Between 1127 and 1279, the Song dynasty lost the northern part of the country to Manchurian nomads, but kept control of the prosperous southern half. So there you can see the Manchurians in the orange had conquered part of the Song, but again the southern Song still held together. During this millennium of strong dynastic rule, Chinese civilization advanced in many ways. They gained a new strand of rice from an area of today's central Vietnam that grew within 3 months instead of the other strain that took 5 months. This allowed for 2 crops to be grown each year, thus doubling food production. The population grew, plus gave more time for small farmers to engage in other trades. They also learned to terrace lands alongside hills to increase production and also develop the water wheel for irrigation of those lands. Silk, cotton, and tea were other products used domestically and for export. When trade was affected along the Silk Road in the 700s, Chinese ships plowed the waters and took goods to the Malay Peninsula, meeting with Indian and Arab merchants as discussed in other chapters. The Chinese developed a magnetic compass for navigation. More importantly, the stability of the regime allowed for the exchange of paper press. It was made from a block of wood with Chinese characters on it. Gutenberg would perfect it with movable type that was metal. There were too many Chinese characters in their language to create a durable system at that time. Finally, the Chinese developed gunpowder, which is used for fireworks and then later for crude military purposes. Again, the West would perfect gunpowder to make it for military activities. And as mentioned before, there was an anti-Buddhist movement in the late Tang Dynasty. Confucianism reemerged after a long decline, but it became a hybrid with some Tao and Buddhist principles. They strived for a better personal morality, but they focused on how to achieve it through Chinese tradition and education to better their life on earth instead of focusing on meditation and nirvana. This is a picture of terraced rice farming. Again, as the population grew, they needed more land, so they cut into the hills and developed rice fields on this terraces. This is a picture of the Chinese movable type. This is wooden. It was not perfect due to all the different Chinese characters for a language, but it did help increase printing. And this is a picture of a woman's foot. People of high society had their daughters bind their foot into balls. It was very painful, but the fact that they would have small feet showed that they were of high aristocracy. The toes would be bent and bound, and they would be kept getting tighter and tighter until you would basically almost have a ball-shaped foot instead of a flat foot. Along the Red River, today's Hanoi, early Vietnamese civilization began with the cultivation of rice. From 218 BCE until 939, the northern area of Vietnam was ruled by the Chinese. The Vietnamese elite conformed to the Chinese written language and Chinese laws, while the peasant populace kept their rural traditions. Again, this northern area of Vietnam would come under control of the Chinese. However, the Vietnamese practiced guerrilla tactics and overthrew the Chinese and were able to become independent and expand south to the Mekong River Valley as the Khmer civilization began its decline. Korea had a very similar history as to that of Vietnam in that it was conquered by the Chinese. They would adopt much of Chinese culture and would become independent of the Chinese. This is the picture of the Korean peninsula. Notice how it is attached to Manchuria. However, just to the east of Korea is the island nation of Japan. Japan borrowed certain aspects of Chinese culture, but due to geography, it was not accessible to Chinese armies, and they were protected by the Korea Strait. The Japanese also developed rice farming, but the area was dominated by rival warrior clans, the Uji. By 500, the Yamato Uji dominated about 2/3 of Japan and thus began Japan's first dynasty. Their religion, Shintoism, was similar to African animism, believing that objects had spirits, mountains, water, along with filial piety of dead ancestors. Prince Shotoku, around 600, sent a mission to China to learn more of their culture and establish commerce. He brought the Confucian civil service back to hire competent administrators rather than having ties with the Uji class. He also embraced Buddhism with the building of temples and monasteries. By 800, Emperor Kamu attempted to create a more traditional Japanese culture and away from China. He moved the capital to Kyoto outside present-day Tokyo. During that same century, they adopted a new alphabet, the kana, with a system of simpler Chinese characters developed for the vernacular or spoken language. By the 12th century, a more decentralized system occurred. The emperor still had federal rule, but warlords created their own armies of samurai. This culture would be ingrained into the Japanese of fighting for honor and valor. They often fought to their death, and if they feel they dishonored their family, it was a common custom to commit suicide or harakiri, which was known as belly cutting. Eventually, the dominant warlord would still respect the tradition of the Yamato dynasty, but would embrace the title of shogun or commander-in-chief of Japan's armed forces. The emperor was revered as a religious figure and lived in isolation, while the real power was with the shogun.